Ready on the diet? I would like to call to order the special meeting of the City of Grand Terrace City Council. If you desire to address the City Council during the meeting with regard to an item on the agenda, please complete a request to speak form available at the entrance and present it to City Clerk. Speakers will be called upon by the Mayor during public comment. At this time, I will convene the City Council and the City Council as a successor agency to the Community Redevelopment Agency. If you would all rise, Councilmember McNamara will lead us in the pledge.
Please join me in the pledge to our nation's flag.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Dorothy. May we have roll call, please?
Councilmember Robles.
Present.
Councilmember Mitchell.
Present.
Councilmember McNamara.
Present.
Mayor Pro Tem Sandoval.
Present.
Mayor Stankiewicz.
Present. Okay, item 1 is public comment. This is an opportunity for members of the public to comment on items on the agenda only. At a special meeting of the City Council pursuant to California law, Council will only be taking public comment on items listed on the agenda. I have no request to speak, so we'll move on to new business. This is a second budget workshop on the 5-year financial analysis and budget stabilization plan. This is primarily designed for the council's discussion with the ad hoc budget committee in attendance. Those members of the budget committee, if you have a question as the presentation goes on, there are forms at the entrance. Please fill out your question and turn it into the clerk. She will give them to me and I'll read them at the appropriate time. The presenter will have quite a bit of information laid out on the podium, and we hope this will alleviate some of the churn of her having to move her information. So if you all could work with that, I'd appreciate it. Again, the budget workshop and 5-year financial stabilization plan. May we have a staff report, please?
As you mentioned, this is the second of 2 budget workshops that the council has scheduled. Your first workshop was on April 22nd, and it was at that time that staff provided to you a 5-year financial analysis for the city general fund and 2 other major funds, along with the budget stabilization plan, which focused primarily on the general fund. Within the stabilization plan, there was information presented with ways to attempt to balance the budget with reductions only. There was also an option presented of possible disincorporation, and there was considerable information presented also on a local revenue measure. It was mentioned at that workshop meeting that the executive officer from LAFCO, who staff has been working with, had offered to come and talk directly with the council, provide you with some additional information on disincorporation, and would be willing to answer your questions. At that point in time, you directed staff to contact LAFCO, which we did, and the executive officer is here with us this evening, and she is ready to answer your questions. As an attachment to the staff report is 2 different publications related to information on disincorporation that were provided for you to be familiar with the subject in advance of Kathy giving her presentation this evening.
Thank you, Betsy. Before we get started, I introduce Kathleen Also want to acknowledge the fact that we have John Futch from Supervisor Ramos' office. Thank you very much for coming. And also Dan Flores, the Chief of Staff of Supervisor Gonzalez's offices. We really appreciate that you're taking the time to show interest in our community and what we're dealing with. Okay. Long name. I would like to introduce Kathleen Rawlings McDonald, who's the Executive Officer of the Local Agency Formation Commission, or LAFCO, of San Bernardino County. Kathleen, welcome.
Thank you. Hopefully my stuff, there's buttons here, and spreading out won't cause anything to pop up somewhere or whatever else.
One of them does shut the lights off.
You know, this is LAFCO. Many people think it's a comedy club. It's not. It's not that funny. We are a state-mandated agency that is created in every county in the state of California. Each has a local representation, and the members on LAFCO, to give you a bit of background, represent the body politic in this county. There are 2 members of the Board of Supervisors who sit on LAFCO. There are 2 members of city councils that sit, 2 members from independent special districts, and those 6 select a public member. So all levels and types of government are represented on the Local Agency Formation Commission. And each of those has an alternate. Presently, the voting members on LAFCO are Supervisor Ramos and Supervisor Lovingood, Larry McAllen from the City of Highland, and Diane Williams from the City of Rancho Cucamonga. Jim Curatalo, who represents the Cucamonga Valley Water District and is our chairman. Kimberly Cox, who represents the Mojave Water Agency, is vice chair. And Jim Bagley from the community of 29 Palms is the public member. And those individuals sit on the commission, and we are concerned with the question of service delivery to the levels of government in this county. There are 24 cities in this county. 7 of them have been formed after 1980. City of Grand Terrace, were formed in 1978, and the City of Rancho Cucamonga was formed in 1979. You were the last pre-Prop 13 cities that were incorporated. And in preparing for today's presentation, I had the opportunity to review the files that related to the incorporation of the city of Grand Terrace. And what was interesting in my review of that is at the time that the matter was being presented to the voters of this community, and there were about 2,600 people who voted on the issue of incorporating the city of Grand Terrace. It was discussed that the city would incorporate with minimal levels of service, with no capital improvement program, no reserves or set-asides, and the need to establish a 6% utility tax within the first few years of incorporation in order to secure a sustainable level of service.
Wait, I'm sorry. You're saying that was in the beginning, in the founding of the city?
Those
a 6% utility tax was in that?
That it said that it was needed.
No, that we needed.
That there was a need to have one. We could not condition that approval, but the recommendation was at the time of your incorporation that a 6% utility tax be presented to the citizens of the then city of Grand Terrace in order to provide for sustainable levels of service.
This is the first time I'm hearing that.
Kathy?
Yes,
I'm
ma'am.
sorry. What time frame was that?
1978.
In which time frame was it supposed to be presented?
It just says as soon as the city incorporated, it got on its feet. The first year of incorporation, many of the services were continued to be provided by the county. It was considered a transition period so that the city could get up and running, establish a staff, do the things that it needed to do to begin to move forward. And within that time period, it was understood or recommended, it wasn't required, it was recommended that the city consider a 6% utility tax.
Thank you.
Because at the time that you incorporated, it was identified that there was not sufficient revenue to increase levels of service, and it even quotes one staff report as saying that it would provide minimal levels of service and no guarantee that you would maintain pre-existing county services. But the desire of the community for Grand Terrace was protectionist. There had been a discussion about the sphere of influence of Colton being expanded to include what was then the community of Grand Terrace. There were other issues included in those discussions, and the residents at the time wanted to protect themselves against the incursion or overlay of the city of Colton. So it was clearly identified in the materials that on that discussion that the level of service and the revenues that were available at the time weren't sufficient for the long term. And that is in 1978. There has been little activity as far as the city of Grand Terrace and LAFCO over that period of time. Although I will say, I became employed by the Local Agency Formation Commission in 1979. There was a reorganization committee put together of the City of Colton, City of Grand Terrace, and City of San Bernardino for the purpose of discussing realigning the boundaries to make more sense, to alleviate pockets and peninsulas. And a committee was put together. Mr. Armstead was on it. I believe Mr. Petta was on it. And it moved forward. And now I was employed there for, I believe, 8 months. And we were sued over the discussion on that reorganization committee. And that review went nowhere. So there has been long discussion about the boundary issues and the formation of the city and its long-term sustainability. But there have been 2 annexations to the city over that period of time, both of which were in the La Loma Hills area. And your sphere of influence is coterminous with your city boundaries. You have no area for expansion. So when you look at the delivery of your services, you must look at the revenues that can be generated within your boundaries, because unless the city of Colton were to consider an exchange of property or agree to detach, this is it. And so what you have and you need to look at is the issues of what revenues can be generated from within your community. Betsy has asked me to talk about a process, and disincorporation is a process. It is a change of organization that is clearly and totally governed by the Cortese-Knox-Hertzberg Local Government Reorganization Act of 2000. That is LAFCO law. It's not, we call it LAFCO law, but other people call it CKH, other people call it different things. But this is the process that would be undertaken should you have to look at the issue of disincorporation. And from the information that I've seen, that is an alternative that you need to look at with some diligence. Because from the information I've seen on going to a part-time city 2 days a week with all contract employees and minimal levels of service, at what point are you saying to your community, you are not a municipality? Because a municipality has a certain requirement and expectation of service, and I'm sure your constituents have the same. And if you can't provide it for whatever reason, then there has to be alternatives to look at. And unfortunately, in this process, disincorporation is one of them. Now I have reviewed with Ms. Adams the potential for, if disincorporation is how you move forward, to look at the formation of a successor agency for at least a part of the services that you provide to retain an identity, if that's what you must choose for Grand Terrace. And that would be the formation of a community services district, which is an independent special district. But before I get into the process overall, I want to be very clear. Disincorporation does nothing to your debt. It does nothing to the existing contracts. LAFCO does not have the ability to renegotiate contracts. The only place that you can look to for that kind of information is the bankruptcy court. And we can all watch with horror and dismay as the city of San Bernardino goes through that process. But the only place where contracts can be renegotiated and bond debt possibly changed, is that process. LAFCO is required by state law to maintain the integrity of bonds. We are required to transfer existing contracts to a successor agency of some sort. So unless the city were to terminate contracts as a part of the overall process before disincorporation were completed, we would have to assign those existing contracts to someone else. Now, LAFCO has extensive conditioning authority, one of which, and most important to this process, is successor agency designation. And we can process a proposal that includes multiple changes within one change of organization. For instance, it could be, if you looked at it and were required to, the disincorporation of Grand Terrace, the formation of a community services district at the same time, a formation of a county service area to take over funding for your existing debt through the county. Because one of the obligations and positions of the Local Agency Formation Commission is existing debt that has been acquired by a municipality or other entity must be borne by the property owners and residents of that area.
Can I ask you a question regarding?
Sure.
In the and this is information that was provided to us. It was very preliminary and very high level. It says the formation of a CSD or community service district requires dedicated revenues to fund the services that it provides, typically through a parcel tax. Is that accurate?
It can be a parcel tax. It can be a share of property tax. As a part of the overall reorganization, a discussion of the existing financial wherewithal of the agency to be readjusted would be addressed. And if the formation of a new CSD, part of that process could be a parcel tax to fund the service. It could be a share of the existing property tax levy.
And who would have the governance, or who would LAFCO as a body do? In the information that was provided to us, there would be a study that would be done regarding our financial condition and what revenues would be required. At that point, would LAFCO as a body, the governing body, decide, oh, the dollar amount is X, Y, and Z, and so they're going to be taxed this much? Is it a body decision? Or?
As part of the plan for service and overall review of a proposal to make these types of changes, yes, sir. The commission would be the authority to review a proposal, and the proposal for a parcel tax would be a part of the election. And depending on the type of tax that it was, whether it was general or special purpose, it could require a 2/3 vote, or it could be a simple majority. It just depends on the process, but it would be part of the election. And that's not to jump around, but you have to remember, disincorporation requires an election. And if the residents of the community object or oppose that, disincorporation can fail.
And so in that, and this is where the gray area, if you will, where it's difficult for me to get very clear information. Let us just say, hypothetically speaking, a revenue measure, tax measure fails. We don't have the revenues to sustain ourselves. You looked at the plans yourself. We don't have city staff. The people of Grand Terrace vote against disincorporating, but there are no funds to continue the service. What happens at that point?
Unfortunately, the city would be a shell. There would be a person that would have to perform the function. There would have to be the only issues that you are obligated to provide is law enforcement, fire protection, land use planning, and roads. So you would need, as a body, as a city council, because you would still exist, be prepared to make the cuts necessary to perform only those absolutely required services in your community. Everything else, if you don't have the money, has to be extinguished. You don't have a choice then. So, but if the residents choose, if you've put that ballot measure forward and it fails, you are still left to perform the state required services for a city.
And does
And
that
you-
include animal control?
I don't know, I know law enforcement, but I don't know if animal control is a required one.
Kathy, when Cortese Knox came about in 2000, we kind of worked in different agencies on how that was going to affect special districts. And my recall, the intent of it was that there were a number of unincorporated islands that were stubbornly against becoming part of a city. There was a number of special districts that created duplication and waste in government. So Cortese Knox Hertzberg Act of 2000 was supposed to give LAFCO the power to kind of say it's time to enter this century. But if I recall, part of that is if we become a CSD, we're a community services district, we're essentially going back on what the pattern's supposed to be, because it was pretty much you had rural California, and as aggregate populations came, the Board of Supervisors would have a municipal advisory council, and then they would, or a community services district. But we're going backwards, where we jumped ahead, did a city, and so we go and say, the citizens say, we don't want to disincorporate, so we become a shell. We have pretty much like a master financial person, right? Just kind of running things.
You have a person, and probably everything else is a contract.
Okay, so then we have that option. And then, but if we do go the CSD route, aren't we there kind of putting ourselves out for
Being included in Colton?
exactly, yeah.
And that's actually.
We can all say that.
I mean, yeah,
Yes.
I mean, you know,
Because that is,
Col-
that
I mean,
is-
Colton would be, could look at us and say, well, we're going to petition LAFCO and say we want to.
The question would become, and LAFCO has used community services districts for a specific purpose, and you are correct. You are going backward, because our purpose and what we've used community services districts throughout this county is to nurture areas for ultimately becoming incorporated cities, to train them so they can understand what is required of them, to understand government requirements, to understand the Brown Act, to understand certain things that are expected of a city council, because this is the highest level, other than you go to a county or others, the highest level there is. The state says you either a county or a city does local land use planning. That's it. The state says a county or a city does law enforcement. A CSD can help fund the county sheriff to provide law enforcement, but it doesn't really get to the point where you can hire your own police force. So yes, the question before you and what you're discussing over the next period of time is reverting back. It is not what we anticipated, but these are unique circumstances. This is a unique era.
Right. Essentially, we are going back to unincorporated territory.
You will be becoming unincorporated.
And
The
so-
land use would
right.
go back to the county.
And so I just want to recap, so the people watching at home. When we incorporated, we didn't have the reserves, we didn't have the adequate capital to finance all the services beyond what an unincorporated territory would provide. And we had told LAFCO 35 years ago that within a year's time frame that we would push for election a 6% utility tax.
The recommendation from the financial consultants hired by LAFCO was that the city would need a 6% utility tax within the first few years in order to fund the sustainable level of service. And you incorporated with services that could not be guaranteed to maintain pre-county service levels.
Right. And
And
then,
I
so,
will-
right, and I don't know if it was appropriate at what point to bring up that we began borrowing from the redevelopment agency.
That's not a LAFCO issue.
Yeah.
That is a
Right.
financial issue with city operations in the past. But You are one of the only 2 cities in the county that created a redevelopment agency over the entire city. And you did so, you were one of the earliest to do that. The question then became, you froze your tax level there. I've looked at the shares for your services, and to be quite honest, you receive about 19% of the general ad valorem tax levy. That's one of the highest. You don't provide fire protection. Fire protection is provided by an overlay now of the San Bernardino County Fire Protection District. And interestingly, because you were a corporate city inside a county service area, because you wish to maintain such at the time you incorporated, you don't pay for county fire administration. So that's another 2.3 to 2.7% that would be going to fire administration, and approximately 10% going for county fire. So your property tax share for municipal required services is about 29%. You are one of the highest shares for that levy of all 24 cities. City of San Bernardino gets 21%. It does police, fire, all of its services. Rancho Cucamonga gets 4%, plus it has an overlaying fire protection district for 15%. So it gets about 19%. So
This was known prior to incorporation, that these tax levels would be?
no, sir, because before you incorporated in 1978, you applied your own tax rate on the tax roll. Prop 13 in 1979 changed that structure. It was recommended that you had $1.35 per $100 of assessed valuation as your property tax. My assumption is that is what was applied to you at the time of your incorporation. That was converted through the Prop 13 process to a share. The general levy is one sum. Everybody gets their shares of it. But your share is in excess of 19%. The county general fund share is 14%.
Now, Kathy, that's what I always wanted to know. Because we incorporated 1978, and Proposition 13 said, okay, now you're going to go back to 1976 and make that your base.
77, 78.
Okay, so make that, so then when we incorporated concurrently then with the Prop 13 valuation. So we didn't have a drop. We stayed.
You were probably better off than most. The city of Rancho Cucamonga incorporated in the 78, 79 time period. And so it didn't have a property tax on the tax rolls. So we had to go back and apply one. And they only got 5%.
Oh, so we were on the roll.
You
so
were
that's
on the
why
roll.
we were protected. Okay.
That's right.
And when you're telling us, and we actually have a healthy share of the tax rate area.
You have a healthy share of what is available, yes. Because if you take what you're required to provide, which is city government and fire protection, it's almost 30%.
Thank you.
So, going back to the process itself, disincorporation is a LAFCO function. It is a standard process for a change of organization, just like a simple annexation. The basic structure of that process is the same. And one of the key components of it is what is known as a plan for service. Because if the city were to propose to disincorporate, you would be required to tell LAFCO how you intended to do that. Such as, you wish to disincorporate, form a community services district to retain certain levels of service, and you would be required to show how you were going to fund them. And the projection that we require is a minimum of 5 years. And so LAFCO, in our review, would look at a number of key components, one of which is determining exactly what your debt was. Because part of the discussion and the responsibility of LAFCO is to ascertain how in the future that debt would be paid. And so we would need to take a look at that. And for those of you who are interested in little buffs on the government code, Government Code Section 56886 defines what are the conditions that can be applied by LAFCO. And we have very broad abilities to look at, and they include the requirement for payment of fixed sums. We can, if there are bonds that have been authorized but not sold, we can require that the bonds be sold. We have a number of issues that must be looked at. But one of the key components when you look at presenting or discussing such a thing is your unfunded actuarial liability for your retirement. Because when you look at disincorporating a city, you are members of PERS. If there isn't a continuing presence in PERS, you will be obligated to pay your unfunded liability over 20 years, and it will be an annual payment. And there would need to be some mechanism to provide for paying that off, one of which may be the requirement that a bond be issued as a part of the disincorporation to pay for those obligations.
And for the public, that's borrowing, right?
Pardon?
If us doing a bond, that means for the public watching at home, we'd be borrowing.
The county service area would be required to somehow borrow money to pay that, or a share of the general property tax, your 19%, can be dedicated to pay whatever those costs are over a 20-year period.
I apologize. I've not heard of a bond being issued for, basically for for future CalPERS obligations.
It's not future obligations. It is an
Current.
existing unfunded liability for your current employees and those that have retired. And it's the requirements to pay them for what benefits they have accrued. So it is not a future obligation. It is when you terminate the city's existence, what those obligations are, and to pay them and make PERS whole.
Got it. And since there's no asset tied to these, is that done at a much higher interest rate? I mean, I just can't see. If I'm an investor, I'm not going to buy a bond to fund
There has to be
retirement
an
obligations.
agency that would fund that. It's possible. A county service area is typically formed under the auspices, or it is formed under the auspices of the county. Typical bonds, while they are taken in the name of a county service area or a zone of a county service area, the holder is the county. The county takes it in the name. So there is a liability potential for the county, but it is then funded through the allocation of property taxes. So, I have to be honest. There has been no disincorporation in this county of San Bernardino ever. There has been a disincorporation in Cabazon in the early 70s, but it was 300 people and a totally dysfunctional city, infighting, other things that made it so that it was not able to function. This is a totally different scenario.
So we're setting precedent. At the end of the day, there's going to be
Potentially,
a lot of
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
if this takes place.
Now,
If this takes place, yes.
now Kathy, because again, so the county, typically I would not see them wanting to take on bonded debt for pension costs. So I would see probably one of the conditions being that part of our 19%, and the bond underwriter too would say, we want to guarantee taxes because they're the most reliable, and
Exactly.
before the housing bubble, the less prone to a high delinquency rate.
Well-
So then that means once we cut into that 19%, there's less for everything else.
Exactly.
Do we,
Because you would have to accept the fact that the services delivered to the community would be lessened. There's, as near as I can tell from the information, little bits of information that I have, and I'm not privy to a lot of the things that you are discussing, but the basis is there isn't enough money to fund the level of service you have now. If you were to disincorporate, you would be obligated to pay your liabilities, and the residual would be left to fund your services. They would have to be reduced.
Yeah, and just for some of my peers that, that don't have the long-term government experience or before I retired from the county, we were already talking about unfunded liabilities in pensions. And that meaning that governments were not putting aside the money to fund the future liability of the pensioner to even be current. Sometimes they were overestimating what their performance was going to be. San Bernardino, the city of San Bernardino did borrow to pay their pension cost, and now they're filing for bankruptcy, and there's been a number of other municipalities that have borrowed, and the debt service, meaning the interest, is very, very onerous. It's a very heavy debt.
Well, but on the reverse, there are very responsible entities that have pension obligation bonds, such as the county. The county's SB Sarah Fund, the county, the AQMD, and some others went together, and they have a pension obligation bond that does, in fact, reduce and make it more efficient for them to fund their obligations. They, too, are under the concern of unfunded liabilities over the recession and the other issues. But there are responsible entities that do have those kinds of bonds.
And then again, see, the county of San Bernardino has its own pension, and that's where I get my pension from. And so if I look at the San Bernardino County Employees Retirement Association Fund, they, I think, made set an estimate they were going to perform 7%, and they haven't performed in maybe one or a negative. So
this year they had 15.9%.
So there is a pension funding crisis.
It is everywhere, but there are responsible ways to address it, and there are other ways.
Betsy, do we have, I know we talked about 2011 valuation by PERS, do we have that number?
Yes, it's, if you dig down, it's on the PERS website, and for the unfunded portion of the retirement obligation, it's a little bit over $8 million. There's also, and I don't know exactly how this would work, Kathy, there's also a medical obligation. We have some people who have retired from the city that have a retiree health benefit, and that liability was, I think, about $1.6 million. So combined in 2011 dollars, it was just under $10 million. At least the retirement portion of it, we think, could increase because PERS has just changed their model, their 15-year smoothing model. They've gone back to 5, and that's why in our 5-year projections, we increase significantly the current cost of retirement. So we have every reason to believe that the unfunded portion could also increase, perhaps in the double digits. We won't know that. I mean, PERS, you have to ask that from PERS. And I mean, obviously, you all know I'm not advocating disincorporation. I'm just saying it's an option, and it's not an easy option. But if there was an interest, I'm sure we could go to PERS and actually pay to have an actuarial study and get that updated. But my sense is it usually takes them 3 to 4 months to complete those studies, and we'll have to.
And the estimates that are on their website are sufficient for at least the preliminary reviews. And if you were going to go to that extent of potentially looking at disincorporation, LAFCO would require that anyway.
So let's just, I just want to make this practical and try to understand the process in my mind. So let's just take this situation. We owe $8 million, 9.6, $10 million to make it even. LAFCO, we disincorporate, there's this obligation that needs to be paid. Is that tax by authority of LAFCO just imposed on the people? Does it have to follow proposition guidelines where the people have to vote to approve that tax?
Exactly.
So if the people vote against that tax, then what happens?
Then typically we would require not that there be another tax, but that your property tax share be allocated in an amount sufficient to pay the annual debt service. And
I see.
PERS will allow, there are other entities that have dissolved where they pay annually to PERS. The successor agency pays an annual payment to PERS. There are other questions. We've not dealt with disincorporation per se. So that's in a general sense what would happen. But you can figure at $10 million, it's probably going to be $150,000 a year.
How would other debts that the city has accrued be
Depends on
handled?
what they are.
Well, we've got a loan or a debt that we've already negotiated with the redevelopment agency, paying it back what had been borrowed over the years. The 3.6, 3.8. We've got a debt to the San Bernardino Valley Water District of
But I don't know if it makes a difference, Kathy. That's a successor agency debt. That's not a general fund debt.
The
What's
question
open,
on
you
what
mean?
would happen to a
Yeah.
successor agency is one I cannot answer, because the successor agency is for the city's redevelopment. I don't know at this point in time what would happen or who would get that.
Well, wait a minute, the mayor's line of thinking though, because my understanding is too, we borrowed money from the redevelopment agency that's a debt of the city, not the successor agency.
And you
So
would be required
how
to
much
pay
is
that.
that? And then we have the Civic Center that was disallowed as a debt of the RDA. That's going to be a continuing payment. And then if there's ever an underbilling or assessment from the auditor controller, and we have, right, an agreement to pay them, that's a debt. So then I'm looking at, if we start getting all these pieces and pecking away, you know, how much of the 19% do we even have?
I don't have all the detail to answer that question. However, contractual debt, the contracts, would be preserved through a LAFCO process. And now you have sales tax revenue, you have subvention revenues, you have other things, and many of those would go to the county, because the only people who can receive those are a city or the county.
So you're going to be in first position
For
any revenues that we have. You're going to be in the first position
For
to
sales
extinguish
tax and
debts.
subventions, there's no question. It's not first position at all. It
It's
has
just-
to go to the county. All of your roads that are in the city, if you disincorporate, become county-maintained roads. They go to the county. The subventions, population subventions go to the county.
'Cause
Sales tax.
Right, because thinking out loud, this is a lot of kind of what I'm doing, and you're just fabulous job explaining
Yes.
everything.
Phenomenal.
But, you know, but my thinking is that once we went to 1978, we're underfunded. In 35 years, we've incurred some debt. Because the city didn't start off with employee pension costs. They didn't start off with a civic center debt. And they didn't, you know, all these things. So now I'm thinking out loud in our committee, you know, to think about putting these pieces together is, do we even have sufficient funds to provide the minimum requirements of a city?
without a tax.
Yeah, without a tax.
Without a special parcel or utility users, or that's something for your finance people to answer. My preliminary assessment is, looking at what little I have to review, I don't think so.
I just want, for people at home and for those of you that are here, just in very, very plain English, say, when we talk about successor agency or redevelopment agency, that was independent from the general fund. The challenges that we have are in our general fund. It would be like your primary home checking account. This other thing that was called the redevelopment agency, funds came into that particular fund. They were supposed to be used for very specific purposes. The city borrowed from it over a period of 15 years, 18 years, to make up for that utility tax, which I just heard about for the first time. That was a recommendation. So now, in essence, the chickens have come home to roost, because that other agency or fund no longer exists. And so everything that you're hearing now, when we talk about successor agency, it's the agency that is taking the place of redevelopment, because that no longer exists by recent state laws that were passed. Okay?
It's actually the agency that was to dissolve the redevelopment, so it's not taking its place.
It is to wind up the affairs.
Yes.
Because if it didn't exist before the date of dissolution, it doesn't exist. So your obligations were set in stone that day. Yes, sir.
And a couple years ago, during public comment, an individual stood up here and said, yes, we borrowed that money and the intent was to let the redevelopment agency expire and we could walk away from that debt. Well, the redevelopment agency didn't get an opportunity to expire. It wasn't going to expire until 2017. The state of California expired it beforehand, so that grand plan was never going to happen. And that's why we're sitting here with the $3.6 million loan to the redevelopment agency that we're trying to pay back.
And then,
Excuse me if I could ask a question. Was the intent for the city to forgive the loan in 2017?
The way that it was explained by the individual when they spoke up at that same podium was that the agency would expire, and at the time that the agency would expire through its charter, 2017, that debt would automatically go away. Sounds
Great banking, if you can find that kind of bank.
But,
yeah.
I know I'm not supposed to ask questions, but did you have a contract to borrow that money? Because when you borrow money from two entities and you can't repay within an existing fiscal year, you're required to have a contract that sets forth a payment schedule with interest rates.
I believe that's how the rules go, yes.
That's
And,
the way they're supposed to work.
but I guess you're saying you don't have that.
No, we do
do
have
now.
that now. We've
We
put
do
that
now.
in place in the
But
last few years.
not when you,
Not at the
Before.
times that those transactions took place,
No.
and when I was
which was quite some time ago.
when I was just a citizen, I got their CAFR, and I found operating transfers going out with no operating transfers coming in. And the thing that I'm thinking out loud too is if we have unfunded pension cost of $8 million, then that means we were not paying as-you-go our pension costs either.
no, that's not accurate.
Nope?
No.
Okay.
Because unfunded actuarial liabilities, you have paid. Because your audit would tell you whether you paid the full amount that you were required to pay into PERS. But your unfunded liability is an actuarial projection to pay the lifetime of the employees you have an obligation for.
Okay. So if we were to end the relationship.
But, if you end that, then it all becomes due and payable. So there's a difference. So you pay what you are required to by PERS, and hopefully the city pays 100% of the bill that they say you pay for both for your employer side and whatever else there is. But this other amount is an unfunded actuarial liability, so that if you end, this is what it will cost to provide the retirement for your former employees.
Steve?
So you don't, you can't do that.
I did just want to confirm, the city has always paid the rate provided by PERS. The underfunding is a system-wide CalPERS problem because of, as we talked about at the 22nd, because of their actuarial assumptions, economic assumptions that have not been realized, their smoothing methodology and whatnot. So they are significantly underfunded, and they are now adopting new policies to become fully funded within 30 years. But those are the things that are driving the significant rate increases that we anticipate and have built into our 5-year projections.
All right, so
The
because,
new calculation is what's in the projections.
well, because someone who used to budget, this is what CalPERS would tell the budgeting people. We're doing so well in the stock market. This is what the rate's going to be. And then 5 years, we're going to go an average, and we're going to have a smoothing, and we're going to do a catch-up. But it was not the expectation that the gaps would be so large. So, okay, so it's clear that we were paying what we were told to pay. But CalPERS had, you know, some expectations that were not met. So now we have
That's
this
correct.
unfunded, yeah.
So, getting back to the process, if there,
You
if
are
it comes,
doing a wonderful job. My God. This
Thank you.
really, I don't even know if you expected this, and you're just doing a wonderful job.
well, this is a very nice crowd. I've been in places that were a lot, where I had deputies sitting right here because people, they were staring behind me as I made a presentation, so this is, thank you very much for that. But the process, as I was saying earlier, is the same for anything that LAFCO does. An application is submitted. This is more complex, more detailed than many that we get, but nonetheless, it is the same type of process that is submitted to LAFCO. We do an analysis, we circulate the proposal for review and comment, and the matter is then presented to the commission for its review. The commission's review is discretionary. They have the ability to approve, modify and approve, or deny 99% of the matters that are presented to them. So theirs is a discretionary action. They will determine the conditions to be applied to the proposal. They will determine the financial allocations that will take place. They will determine the additional agencies that will be formed to succeed to certain portions of it. We would need to look at the question of successor agency and determine how that would work, the creation of entities to take care of the funding for your obligations. All of those things would need to be addressed and presented to the commission for their review and approval. If they approved such a proposal, then it will go to the electors. And it is that point where the citizens of Grand Terrace will ultimately decide.
And at that time, the price tag for this would
Yes,
be attached to that information.
The choices on funding all of that will be made. If it is a parcel tax to be assigned for the continuation of a certain level of service, that will be identified, and it will be part and parcel of the overall change of organization, because it cannot succeed if the parcel tax or the funding is not there. It will clearly state if an entity is to receive a share of your existing general property tax to fund a certain level. It will identify how the future agency will be structured. If it's a formation of a community services district, there will be an election for the 5 members that will be elected to sit on that board of directors. All of these things will be presented to the electorate, and they will ultimately decide. The choices will ultimately be made by the registered voters in Grand Terrace. My job is to take that information, to analyze it, to present the financial aspects of it, and present that to the commission. Now, in looking at disincorporation, there are a number of things that have to be addressed, and one of which is, and I'm not all that excited about some of these items, but for a disincorporation, through the termination of the city's jurisdiction, LAFCO is to prepare and certify a written statement to the successor agency and the Board of Supervisors of the indebtedness of the city, the amount of money in its treasury, the amount of any tax levy or other obligation which is unpaid and has not been collected. So at the end of this process, before the disincorporation is finalized, we have to prepare that written statement. And so essentially we would be obligated to perform a forensic audit so that we could tell everyone, this is the money they have, this is the money and where it's going to go, these are the shares and all of those things. The question that is silent here is who pays LAFCO to do that?
Exactly.
And how long? Because if I saw in the information that's provided to us, 2 years is the amount of time that it takes.
Disincorporation, under the best of circumstances, it could be 18 months, but typically I would estimate it would be 2 years, because that's what it takes to process an incorporation. And what you're doing here is unraveling the same thing.
But there is, okay. obviously there would be a significant catch-22, and I believe that if we do go down this route, if this really is the will of the people of Grand Terrace, we're going to have to develop new processes or policies or procedures because we don't have money for 2 years. And so what would happen in the meantime?
That
It's so
is-
significant that we wouldn't meet our mandated requirements.
You're going to have to make some very, very difficult choices. But there's no getting around that.
But-
There's no way to make this process simple or expedient.
But if we can't meet mandated requirements, what happens?
The catch-22 is, we
If-
make those types of cuts, there's nobody here
To do them.
to unwind.
Exactly. So there would be, to be honest, sir, I don't know. If I'm presented with that kind of application, I will need to ascertain what kind of staffing would be necessary and to seek loans in order to process and to unwind the affairs of the city. Because if there isn't sufficient revenue to provide the assistance to get this through, because to disincorporate is going to require your staff to assist LAFCO in understanding how the city operates.
That we just laid off.
Excuse me.
Do you see my?
So you are really in a very difficult position, you as the elected representatives for the city, because unfortunately, it will be on your shoulders to decide what to do. If the citizens are unwilling to provide additional revenues to keep the city operating, then it is incumbent on you to make the cuts necessary to meet your obligations. And you will be forced to make some very, in my view, difficult decisions. And there's no way, in my opinion, to sugarcoat that.
No, and if the cuts fall below mandated requirements,
There's no mandated level. You have to provide law enforcement.
Yeah, public
If-
safety.
If public safety,
Mhm.
if it's one deputy, 24/7, and that's all you have, that's all you have. If it's for land use planning, if it's on an as-need basis, you only have a contract for when you need somebody to come in.
so we could still, because there are not levels assigned to mandated requirements, I got it.
Yeah, nobody says what level you have to provide it, just that you have to provide it.
something.
For instance, fire protection. I won't name names, but I've had a city who's asked me if I have a fire chief in an all-volunteer force, have I met the mandate? And the answer is yes. Your people's fire insurance will go through the roof. Other things will happen, but have you met your obligation as a city? Yes, you have.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
there's nothing that says what level you have to provide, simply that you provide it.
Now, anticipating LAFCO costs, 'cause I didn't get to really follow too much of the incorporation of Highland, but it was a big process. And so if you're talking for forensic audit, you're talking possibly hiring.
We would hire an audit firm,
Okay, so there's a price tag there.
yes?
And then the other, when we're talking about LAFCO coming in and saying there has to be a parcel tax, is that subject to Prop 218?
Yes, it is.
So we have another, so if you don't get 2/3 vote
Exactly.
from the citizens
Well,
for parcel.
it
Okay.
depends on the type of tax you choose.
Okay,
Some require 2/3, some require simple majority. And we would have to look at making this as simple as possible.
so this could be as simple as possible, meaning a special tax, the lowest vote, and the special tax is simply to go to extinguish
Yes.
debt. Okay.
It can be, there can be two debts, one to a county service area to pay debt, one to fund services through CSD. But I would venture and hazard a guess that two taxes on one ballot measure doesn't stand a prayer of passage. So, these are the types of things that we will have to work with the community. But, yes.
Just to make people aware how serious this is, we've got some individuals in the audience who are from our joint powers insurance pool, because this is a concern to that organization as well. Our risks are shared by many other communities, and their responsibility is to protect the pool. And that's why they're here listening to what's going on. It's serious enough that they need to take a look at it as well. That is something I don't want to see happen, is Grand Terrace be asked to leave that pool. If we have to go out and buy our own liability insurance, you're talking about another huge, huge cost.
Yes, sir.
All right.
And I thank you gentlemen for coming. I appreciate that you're showing interest in what we're going through.
I'm glad I forgot they were here. I'm just thinking of all the different thresholds of voters voting to disincorporate, that failing, voters failing to pass a way for us to extinguish our debt. No one has brought up from staff or even amongst ourselves has entertained the B word, the bankruptcy.
Well,
I
on the-
mean, Betsy, has anybody ever?
We looked at that previously, and it's
Okay.
not really an option for us because we don't have debt.
Well, we don't have, it's not our options, it's what the citizens vote. So we may be given that,
There wouldn't be
But,
a lot of
I
There's
guess my,
not-
We don't have the debt obligations
no, what I'm
that bankruptcy would
saying,
protect us.
it's not up to us to decide. If we have the citizens voting against revenue enhancements to save the city, and then even if they go we go to a CSD or we go to unincorporated territory and they do not meet the voter threshold to extinguish our debt, there is no other way to go.
but I don't know that federal bankruptcy will, other than extend the term of payment, you don't have anything
To bankrupt.
for them to
Dismiss.
administer and change. It's typically to renegotiate contracts. Your contract is with the sheriff. You have the ability now to reduce the level of sheriff's protection. You don't, your employee contracts, those could be reopened, but as far as I know, you don't have very many employees left.
And, well, actually, and the CalPERS is an open issue right now in some of the courts.
It's an issue being pondered.
Right.
It's an issue being addressed. There are people looking at San Bernardino and its position related to CalPERS, and CalPERS is looking to make what that decision will mean, and it will be a long, hard fight.
But we do have contracts, but we have debt. We do have debt.
Well,
That's not
the
gonna
only
go
thing that
away.
debt can be done is to renegotiate the terms of your debt and extend it. It doesn't extinguish it.
Yeah, it
Right.
won't dismiss any debt that we have.
Right. Okay, but then this is then where it becomes cognitive dissonance for me, because if it comes out of our hands and it goes to LAFCO and you can't get the money, well, you have the 19%. Okay, there we go.
And as I said early on, we have an obligation and a legislative requirement to take care of bondholders and other debt obligations.
Yeah.
That will then leave a certain amount of money to pay for services.
So it's not bankruptcy, but it is a reorganization and it is an extinguishment of debt, but it's the county that's.
It's reallocation of the debt
Mhm.
and determining, based upon the LAFCO process, what the level of service will be.
Yeah. Well,
And it will
eventually-
not be what you have now.
Mhm.
And I can say that without a proposal, understanding what I've seen of your budget documents, to say it will not be what you have now.
I appreciate your courage in telling the truth and not sugarcoating things. I think for a lot of years, things have been sugar-coated, and it's just so dang refreshing to just hear it straight.
Well, Sylvia is a former county employee who worked with me over the years, and I'm not good at diplomacy. Most people will tell you.
Yeah. You're worth every cent the county pays you.
I'm much better at being very straightforward, and so that is my purpose here, is to explain the process, to explain in the best way I know how, given the information I do have, as to what that will entail.
I have a process question for you.
Sure.
When we talk about a measure going on the ballot for disincorporation, I'm reading here that more than 25% of the city's registered voters must sign a petition.
That is not, that's a protest process.
Okay.
And that's
Will you talk about that a little bit, please?
In the protest process, that is a typical annexation process, and that's for the formation of a CSD. But in the overall reorganization where disincorporation would be a component, the requirements are for the single most stringent requirement. Disincorporation requires an election. There's no need for that petition process. It will simply go to an election. The elements of that election are the ones that will be decided by the commission overall, such as the formation of a CSD, the funding issues, and so on and so forth. But regardless, for disincorporation, it will go to an election.
I just want to read, this is another part from the information that you provided us. If a city or group of citizens want to pursue disincorporation, the support of the local LAFCO is critical, absent a legislative amendment or exception to the act. LAFCO has near total control over the process and can modify or condition proposals as it sees fit. Disincorporation is a controversial option, and at least some citizens, let alone creditors and others with a stake in the city's continued existence, should be expected to oppose it. So this is not an easy process, regardless of where we go.
I believe that's an understatement.
Yeah. Any other questions for Catherine?
I just want to say you make me nostalgic for the days when I would be out in the various nooks and crannies with sheriff's deputies protecting me.
Back in the day when Supervisor Reardon would send you out to the hinterlands, yes. Yes, Sylvia, I do remember.
I just, for the people, disincorporation is not option one. And I think it's important that people understand that. We have two choices before us, and neither one of them is optimum or optimal. We have a choice to tax ourselves and to be able to pay for the level of service that we've received and come to enjoy from this city. This city will no longer exist as a welfare off some state fund borrowing at will to be able to fund operations. Our city will be in our hands. I believe that disincorporation is very dangerous for those of us who are property owners here, because I believe that our property values will decline almost immediately. I believe that those that can afford it will move out of Grand Terrace. And I believe that the city in and of itself, because what makes this community great is not this council, and it's not city staff, and it's not sheriffs. It's each and every one of us as private, individual citizens that love this city so much. My parents moved here in '78. When this city became a town, I came here to this city hall. I came to some of our first council meetings as a child because it meant so much to become a city. And I can't tell you how many sleepless nights every member on this council has had regarding this very fiscal financial issue that we are facing. And this is not something that can be resolved by us as a council or by any one group, but it is going to require each individual taking very decisive action to preserve this city. There are no more old guard, new guard, right guard. There's just one community, and what we face threatens us all. But yet, if we work together, I am very confident that we'll be able to move on, and this will be a thing of the past, and we'll be able to finally deal with the financial challenges that have been developed, that were 20 years in the making. The buck stops here, and we'll be the ones to resolve this matter once and for all. And I absolutely believe that. Those are my comments.
I just want to say that I really have great sympathy for my peers because they've been dealing with this silently for a couple of years. I just got on the council in November. But I have great faith in our community, and so I'm very comfortable that our community is going to do the right thing. Everyone that is in my sphere that I talk to says that they want to do whatever it takes to keep the city going. But I can understand when you're waiting for this day to come, when you can start taking steps to resolve a problem, how difficult that must have been for the Councilman Sandoval, Mayor Stankovic, and for Councilwoman Darcy McNaball. I mean, I have to applaud the difficult decisions they made in cutting staff over their term, and to have wrestled on a nightly basis with this culmination of where we're at today. And I just wanted to make sure I expressed that, and you know, and we're going to get through this.
Kathleen, thank you so much for being here and to give us the facts. I think it's very important for us all to know the actual facts. We've had a lot of rumor, we've had a lot of speculation about the situation that we're in and the choices that we have to make, and I appreciate that you made very clear on what this choice would entail if that is what people believe that they want. And it does nothing but help to really put in perspective just how difficult all of our choices are. But I really appreciate the facts that we have now about this choice. Thank you so much.
You're more than welcome. If you are going to make such a profound decision, I wanted to make sure that I could provide you with the best information on that, because it truthfully is a profound decision that would be made. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathleen. We did this tonight as an educational experience for all of us, not just us up here. We're going to get this information one way or the other, but we want ad hoc budget committee to be aware of what's the process, the pitfalls, and we want the community to be aware of. This particular alternative was one of those that was in the 5-year budget plan, and we wanted to have it explained to the community so you know how serious some of these alternatives could be and what the ramifications to our fair city would be. We have by no means made any decisions on what we're going to do, and you can bet on my part, if we're stuck with this as our alternative, then this council has exhausted everything else. This is not a pleasant alternative, and I do not want to deal with it. And I will do everything I can to keep the city the way we have it now. Okay. The next regular city council meeting will be held on Tuesday, May 14th at 6 p.m. Agenda items must be submitted in writing to the city clerk no later than 14 calendar days preceding the meeting. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everybody that came.
But anyway, I wanted to thank the chamber again, and thank you for coming and bringing me in.
Thank you, Bob.
Can I take another couple minutes? Yes? No? Okay, I'll go fast. Number one, I do have a check for $250 that we'd like to donate on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce and Food Connection, and thanks to the residents who participated in the fundraiser that's for the paramedic fund. I also would like to tell everyone that we are having our installation dinner on Thursday evening. Yes, there is still time, and I think there's 88 people right now. We will be having a chamber mixer on July 7th at Blue Mountain Beer Company. And I believe we'll be celebrating a birthday, a special birthday, right? Does that count, right, Councilman? Right. At the same time. I did speak with Grand Terrace Care Center, Jeff Stewart. They would like to help with the fundraising for the parents.